thank you all for coming to the launch of Rearming the ANZACs. I think the last major thing we're going to launch this year, so we're ending on a high note. This rather handsome little volume is the start of what I hope is going to become a large series of ASPI studies into capability development and defence industry procurement. And I'm delighted that Kim Gillis is here today to help us launch Robert's book, because it was over several breakfasts, as it happens, Kim, that we... One too many, a few smashed avocados, you might say, where we cooked up the idea that what was needed to help people actually think their way through the challenges of modern defence procurement was not large and complicated audit office studies, but actually publications which told the human story of how defence goes about the business of acquiring defence equipment. And the human story is the relevant point, because this is decisions, often of individuals, in the case of defence occasionally of committees, which is responsible for actually investing the hundreds of millions of dollars, the billions of dollars that government provides the organisation for military equipment. And I think Robert Macklin has done a wonderful job here to bring out exactly that human story, indeed what Kim described to me as something of a page turner, if you could believe that there could be such a thing as a page turner about a series of decisions to modernise the weapon systems and sensors of the ANZAC frigates. So let me introduce the two people who will speak this evening. Kim is going to launch the book, then I'm going to give Robert the opportunity to make a few comments, and we'll finish with a few questions, and then I'm sure what many of you now have come to expect is delightful ASPI drinks and snacks afterwards. So, firstly, Kim. Kim will be known to many of you here, of course. It was appointed as the Deputy Secretary Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, CASG, on the 31st of August 2015. Kim's responsible for the CASG portfolio of acquisition projects and sustainment products that procure and sustain material capability for the Australian Defence Force. Prior to joining the department, Kim was the Vice President and Managing Director of Boeing Defence Australia, managing all of Boeing Defence Australia's businesses and functions at the organisation's 15 sites across the country and 4 international locations. And prior to that, Kim was General Manager Systems for the then Defence Materiel Organisation, in which role he led the reform agenda for DMO acquisition and sustainment in an environment of significant change, when is it not, Kim, as a result of major defence-wide reforms. Kim's also worked for Austal, where he led the capture team and was the lead project management for the US Navy Littoral Combat Ship, the Joint High-Speed Vessel Program, and the Royal Australian Navy's Armidale-class patrol boat fleet. Interestingly, for our purposes, Kim was also the founder and sponsor of Queensland University of Technology's Executive Masters in Complex Project Management and the International Centre for Complex Project Management. And I mention that because it does go to, I think, the strong sort of education role that Kim sees for this book and for the many that will follow it, I hope, over coming years. So that's Kim. Let me just briefly tell you about Robert Macklin, one of Australia's most respected and popular authors of Australian history and biography. Now, I have to say this is probably one of the slimmest books that Robert has been responsible for writing. He has written 4 novels and 23 books of non-fiction, which have won many prizes, including the prestigious $30,000 Blake Dawson Award for his history of BHP Billiton called The Big Fella in 2009, and his controversial history of Norfolk Island, Dark Paradise, in 2013, won the Canberra Critics Circle Award for the best book of the year, as did an earlier one, which I've read, called One False Move, the story of 4 Australian naval officers who travelled to Britain in World War II and volunteered to defuse the massive German parachute mines that were being dropped on English cities and ports. Robert is the authorised biographer of former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. I would recommend Robert's biography rather than Mr. Rudd's autobiography, to be perfectly honest with you. He's written a best-selling book on Hamilton Hume and a number of biographies of SAS soldiers, and a very authoritative history of Australia's special forces and the intelligence agencies and the interaction between the special forces and intelligence agencies, called Warrior Elite. Now, I'm going to offer Robert a free plug. This is his latest book. This is the standard Meklin volume. Robert manages to push out one of these about every 11 to 12 months or so. I don't know how you do it. Dragon and Kangaroo, The Hidden History of Australia-China Relations, which was published in August of this year. Born in Queensland, educated at Brisbane Grammar School and the University of Queensland and the ANU. Robert has been, in the past, a jackaroo, a leading journalist, a documentary filmmaker, a university lecturer, and was in government the press secretary to briefly serving Australian Prime Minister Blackjack McEwen. So a man of many parts. And I can't say how delighted we were, Robert, that you were prepared to take on the commission to produce this little study. So first up, ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to welcome Kim Gillis. Kim.
Welcome, distinguished guests. Ladies and gentlemen, and a very special welcome to Ian Crozier. Now, I said that on the assumption that Ian would be here, but in true Ian fashion, he's now meeting with somebody about some engineering change that's going to happen. So I think that it speaks volumes of Ian. And to all those who created, built and operated what has become a world-leading capability, many of you in the room today. I've had the privilege over the last 25 years of managing a number of major complex projects. I enjoy them all, and at this point in my career, I've gained great satisfaction in being able to see the fruits of my labours, defending Australia and providing critical support in the region across the globe. One of the consistent themes in all these projects was that they were all firsts for me and for my teams. No one in the team had built a naval patrol vessel, built a littoral combat ship, project managed the construction of 2 of Australia's largest warships, the LHD, or delivered the world-leading airborne early warning capability, now known as the Wedgetail. None of my team had worked on any of those things before, but all these capabilities had been done somewhere in the world by similar teams with varying degrees of technology, with success and sometimes with failure. So why couldn't I learn from others so that I didn't make similar mistakes, or more importantly, learn how they made great decisions that led to achieving that breakthrough technologies of the past? One of those reasons for failing was that I'm not an engineer. I say that because it is only the detailed focused engineers who work on the projects who stay around long after we, the project managers, bask in the glory of success and move on to bigger and better projects. It's the engineers who have traditionally sat down and written what had actually happened and what lessons could be communicated to the next generation. The problem is, for some of you, abundantly clear. I use the word engineer, writing, communication in the same sentence. I've actually found lots of spreadsheets that contain detailed statements of why a particular technology failed on its 15th attempt and the brilliant solution that was arrived at to resolve that problem. I've also even found statements like we had insufficient schedule, budget and requirements, so the project was destined to fail, but not much really about what actually happened. I say this mostly in jest. The problems with lessons learnt is the majority of cases the period between one complex project or technology and the next can be sometimes 20 or 30 years, and a spreadsheet buried deep in the dark caverns of the defence IT system is not the most accessible or attractive thing to be looking for, let alone the joy of deciphering the engineering speak into English. Earlier this year, over many breakfasts, I sat down with Peter and gave him a challenge. I want a lessons learnt book that does not look or read like a lessons learnt. I want it to be a ripping yarn. And once you pick it up, you won't want to put it down. It had to tell the whole truth, the good, the bad and the ugly, what we did wrong, how did we fix it, and what we could do better the next time. It had to be less than 100 pages. For we project managers who have the attention span of dead gnats, you've got to be able to give it to us short. And finally, I wanted it written by a professional journalist or writer who could tell a story. Today, we release the first of what I believe will be a series of books that achieves all of these objectives and more. In selecting Robert Macklin for the task to author the first of these series, we have one of Australia's greatest storytellers. Robert is passionate about defence and defence technology, and when given the challenge of writing this book, he grabbed it with both hands. I selected the ASMD story for the first of this series for a few reasons. It's one of the great untold stories of Australian technology, know-how and determination. It's a story of how Australian industry can produce world-leading capabilities if given the chance to support it from we the customers. It's a story about a great national institution and treasure, Ian Crozier, and the story of Ian and David Gould and the vision of a company that would catch one late night watches as at sea as naval officers. It's the story of the teams of Saab and BAE who work with Ian and his team. It's a story of risk aversion and risk mitigation. Most importantly, it's a story about people and how people behave under pressure and how the system within defence manages those risks on behalf of the Australian taxpayer and in this case on the part of the Australian Navy sailors who serve our country. The ASMD story is a reminder that when industry, our defence science community, the capability managers, the acquisition staff all work together to achieve a single-minded and focused outcome, Australia and Australians can achieve almost any challenge that we are set. I had the privilege of attending many of the meetings between Defence and CEA, Saab and BAE that were reported in this book. It was not my project. Warrens and Steve Gumleys and Commodores down here. Lots of people in the room have their fingerprints all over this. But it was big enough and problematic enough, I observed it with interest. So as an independent observer, my view is that Robert has picked the essence of the project, the essence of the thinking process, the essence of the challenge that the team confronted, and most importantly, the essence of how and why this monster of a project was dragged kicking and screaming into what now has become the world-leading anti-ship missile defence capability. As I've said, this is the first of a series. The next of the series, Bushmaster, will be released in early 2018, written by another of Australia's great storytellers, Brendan Nicholson. It is my intent to have 4 of these publications produced each and every year going forward. So, Peter, I've now formally made that statement. My vision for this series is that it becomes a reference library for the next generation of leaders, project managers and engineers. It should be on the reading list for all future staff college courses, technical courses, and it should be shared widely within the broader defence and industry community. I can also see it gracing the parliamentary library for future defence ministers to read and learn from the great decisions of their predecessors. And I had a request from the Prime Minister before I came here to add it to his Christmas reading list. I commend this publication to you. I congratulate ASPI for taking on the challenge, Robert Macklin for doing such a great job in writing this book, and as like the ASMD, it exceeds all of our expectations. So thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very, very much for that introduction, and thank you, Peter, for having us here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight, and much more so than you might think. The reason I say that is that after I signed the contract to research and write the book, and before I actually began the job, I almost died. I was felled by pneumonia and a collapsed lung that saw me in 2 Canberra hospitals for more than a week, and there were times when I'm sure I heard the rustle of angels' wings, though it just might have been the dreadful wheezing from the person in the bed next door. Actually, she was the reason that for the second hospital. I started in Canberra General, and had I not moved to Canberra Private, I'm sure she would have been the death of me. However, as you see, I survived. But when I left the hospital, I was not in the best condition. In fact, I was very concerned that I might not be able to undertake the book at all. and if I did, it was very unlikely that I would meet the deadline of the contract. So I contacted Peter Jennings and explained my concerns. I really can't tell you how grateful I am for Peter's response. Basically, it was no pressure, just get better and the job will be waiting for you. That vote of confidence did wonders, and I'm thrilled to say that we met the deadline, and today, less than 12 months later, I'm fitter than I have ever been and that I can ever remember. And I'm deeply proud of the book. I was not only lucky in having Peter's confidence, I was also very fortunate in working with Andrew Davies and my very close associate, James Mugg. James was invaluable. He organised the interviews, liaised between the very busy interviewees and myself, and particularly in the early weeks when I was recovering, he was enormously thoughtful in making the best use of me. One of the first interviews that he organised was with Kim Gillis. And I have to say, I've rarely had a more engaging set of writing instructions. Kim just said basically, it's a great story, go for it. And so we did. The trouble was, coming to it cold, I really didn't know what the story was, except that it had to do with putting some armaments on warships. I had a vague idea what a frigate was, since I'd read a book called The Cruel Sea by Nicholas Montserrat. In fact, I'd read it twice, so I even knew what a corvette was. It was smaller. But somehow, we began our research, as a sailor might say, arse up. That is, we began at the wrong end of the timeline by talking with John Runge, who was the Defence Department's liaison with CEA, which I'd barely heard of at the time, and we met in their new building at Fyshwick. John was tremendously helpful. His task, he said, was dealing with all the domestic and overseas people who wanted access to something called phased array radar that CEA had developed. It seemed they were beating down the doors, and John's task, at least in part, was to defend the sovereign asset that it represented. I was still stuck with phased array radar. While I had no doubt from John's demeanour that it was a major sovereign asset, I had not the faintest clue what he was talking about. In fact, for the first month, I felt like the metaphorical blind man in a room with an elephant, trying to gain an idea of its shape by feeling its tail. And though I had read Kim the Jungle Boy by Rudyard Kipling, I was no wiser about the shape of this particular elephant. In fact, I remained that way until sometime in March, when I finally met Commander Rob Elliott. Over time, Rob started me at the trunk and eventually worked our way over the top, down the flanks, under the belly, and back to the tail. That was the key. Because once I saw the outlines of it, I realised that it wasn't an elephant at all. It had instead the fearful symmetry, all its own, as perfect as William Blake's tiger, or better yet, a play by the great Sophocles. It had a good, sharp opening scene, a troubled childhood, a disastrously conflicted youth, and just before it went entirely off the rails, the Deus ex machina in the form of Ian Crozier intervened and made it all turn out for the best. After that, all I really had to do was fill in the dialogue. In the event, it was a little trickier than that because I was dealing with many different points of view. At times, if I could change the metaphor, it felt a little like a Kurosawa movie, where the same set of facts has many different interpretations. So it was necessary to engage my own point of view in deciding where to give the greater weight to the facts of the matter. Experience helped there, as did the ready advice of Peter and Andrew. Actually, that was where the story became particularly interesting to me, because while my knowledge of warships was limited, I did have a view about the manner in which warfare itself would be conducted in the 21st century. That came from the immense research effort involved in in 3 biographies of Special Forces soldiers, and then in the history of the Special Forces and the intelligence agencies that Peter spoke of, with whom they work increasingly closely from World War II to the present day. And indeed, I looked a little into the future at the appropriate shape of our defences in the years ahead. It was published with an excellent preface, generously contributed by Peter, under the somewhat off-putting title, much against my will I should say, of Warrior Elite. Fortunately, I understand from my publisher that it could well be reissued next year under my preferred title of either the New Centurions or the Secret Army. The point of this diversion is that in my scenario, there's very little room made for either the big army of the 20th century or indeed the big Air Force or the big Navy. The vision is for Special Forces to be the hard cutting edge and the role of the other services to be the handle of the tomahawk that gives the cutting edge its strength. So initially I really didn't see where these 8 ANZAC class frigates fitted into the overall scheme of things. It wasn't until I'd travelled well into the belly of the beast that I saw with great clarity that once they had been rearmed with phased array radar and improved defensive and offensive missiles, they would be perfectly fitted for the role of escorting the 2 amphibious assault ships, Canberra and Adelaide, that would deploy our forces at sea, whatever the required strength might be. Equally, the new class of submarines would play vital roles in the actions, short of all-out war, that might be expected in the region in the years ahead. So, I returned to the task with renewed vigour. But the aspect of the project that pleased me most was the discovery of the astonishing achievements, against all odds, of Ian Crozier and his CEA operation that I was privileged to explore with Ian as the guide. It took a while, but I finally understood, at least in broad terms, what phased array radar is all about. And it gave me tremendous pleasure to be able to write this aspect of their story and to do it in a way which I hope will spread the word of their great capabilities to as wide an audience as possible. For while the intention of the series is to lay out the do's and don'ts, the pitfalls and pratfalls to be avoided in the great task of military procurement, I am hoping that it will also serve a wider role in giving confidence to the Australian government and to Australian industry in our capability as a nation to secure and serve our own defence needs. If my work has contributed in some small way to that end, then I will be well pleased. Indeed, I'll feel that I've repaid at least part of the debt I owe to Peter and ASPI in rearming my own capability for renewed health and happiness in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Now, I see Deputy Chief of Navy has come to his feet, so there's bound to be a statement you want to make as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the risk of getting between you and the wonderful hospitality you know that awaits from ASPI, I'd like to just congratulate you, Robert, for the story, Kim and Peter for the vision to bring it together, because on behalf of Navy, the ANZAC story is a great story, and I recognise a number of people in the room here that have contributed to what the book actually represents. I was privileged to be in the first ship, ANZAC, when it commissioned as part of the commissioning crew in 1996, and the ships have come a long way in terms of what they've done and what they have now in terms of capability. I think moving forward is really important to recognise is that these ships in their upgraded configuration are likely to be serving into the mid-2040s at a time where we are focused on the introduction of some really exciting new capability, and we know what that looks like. We've seen the first of the air warfare destroyers delivered. We're looking at the replacement to the ANZACs, and despite the fact that there are some people in this room that are very keen to know what the outcome of that replacement is going to be, these ships are going to be serving our country for the next 30 years. And that is a true indication as to how well we got it right in terms of bringing that capability piece that Navy needed, the know-how of industry, and the commitment of a wide variety of stakeholders to actually draw upon the best of Australian innovation, technology and know-how to bring a true capability to life. So I think telling that story is really important. Often people will focus on technology, and it is a great technology, but the people aspect to what's been achieved here is going to be the really important story in terms of, as we look back over the last 50 years and the future 50 years in terms of delivering true naval capability in this country, it's going to be the people story that's actually going to count. So, well done, and thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.